Hello and welcome back. This is the week 3 lecture. So today we're talking about Raising Arizona, written and directed by the Coen brothers. This film came out in 1987, so we are continuing to make our way up through the second half of the 80s. And this was the second film from the Coen brothers. They are pretty famous filmmakers nowadays. I expect that most of us are pretty familiar with Joel and Ethan Coen. We might not distinguish between the two because they are often referred to simply as the Coen brothers. We can continue to do that, but just for the sake of specificity, you might want to know, and I mentioned this in the week 3 module, that typically Joel Coen directs the films and collaborates on the screenplays with his brother Ethan, and then Ethan also typically serves as one of the producers of their films. So, if we want to get specific about the director, generally that's going to be Joel. If we're talking about the screenplay, like I said, Joel and Ethan typically collaborate on those. So it might be useful to know some of those details, but we can also just kind of lump them together because that's typically how the press treats them. That's typically, again, how they are referred to in popular culture, in writing, and they are written about quite a bit. They've done some well-known films. This is another example of a trajectory that we are going to see a lot in this class. I've already mentioned it before, but this tendency for, indie filmmakers to make it big and then they kind of cease to be indie. Once they get discovered, they can start making bigger budget films, usually for major studios, where obviously they have more resources and they can do more things. So that kind of happens with the Coens, but it might be useful to think a little bit about their career as a whole. We'll talk about that a little bit today in lecture because we are coming in pretty early in their career. This is their second film. Coming out in 87. Their first film was Blood Simple, which came out in 1984. I was very tempted to use Blood Simple as our Coen brothers film in this class, mostly because I think it's a better movie than Raising Arizona, but it doesn't work quite as well for our chronology. Because, of course, we started with another film, a different film from 1984, which was Stranger Than Paradise. And I thought Blood Simple would be a little bit of a tougher place to start, honestly, because it really is an homage to film noir, a particular style of filmmaking that we can discuss at least briefly today, because the Coens returned to film noir at various points throughout their career. And, Blood Simple's a good film. It's still pretty accessible, but I think to fully appreciate it, you kind of have to know a little bit about film noir as sort of a style, a larger genre, the history of it, because as we're going to talk about today, the Coens are kind of film nerds, and they often draw on rather obscure corners of film history, and a lot of older films and older filmmakers influence their work. So Blood Simple requires a little bit of additional knowledge, whereas I think Raising Arizona can be appreciated a little bit more easily, even if you're not all that familiar with the Coen brothers, and you don't have to be familiar with any particular style of older filmmaking. Although, again, we're going to talk about ways in which Raising Arizona is influenced by previous directors, previous movies, because the Coen brothers are kind of steeped in film lore and history, so a lot of that stuff does show up throughout their catalog. But again, I'm guessing at least some of us are familiar with the Coen brothers, and you might have seen some of their other films, just to kind of pick up after Raising Arizona to continue along their career sort of progression. In 1990, they did a film called Miller's Crossing, which was pretty famous. Again, very much a crime drama, sort of in that film noir style. In 96, Fargo came out. You're probably familiar with that movie, even if you haven't seen it. It kind of made a big impact on our larger popular culture, and since then, a TV show based on the film has also debuted. In 1998, they came out with The Big Lebowski, which of course has attained real cult status by today. A couple of years later, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou came out in the year 2000, another film that's pretty popular. A lot of people love it. One of my favorites of theirs in 2007, No Country for Old Men. That's based on a Cormac McCarthy novel, so it's very literary, and I think that's one of their finer films. Some other stuff, Burn After Reading came out in '08 with Brad Pitt. That was more of a sort of broad comedy. True Grit in 2010, a really good remake of a classic Western film. The remake that they did stars Matt Damon, Jeff Bridges, really good. I think in 2013, Inside Llewyn Davis, another pretty famous film with Oscar Isaac. More recently, Hail Caesar in 2016, and The Ballad of Buster Scruggs in 2018. So a big body of work. Obviously, they've been making films ever since the 80s, and a lot of those films have really become quite popular and, watched by many, profitable. And again, they've made this transition really into pretty mainstream filmmakers. I would argue that they still have a pretty distinctive style. Their films are a little bit offbeat and idiosyncratic in certain ways, maybe more so than, typical studio films that we would expect to see, but their budgets have gotten bigger, and after their early films, they really did start with indie productions, and as we're going to see today, they even worked with sort of an independent distribution company initially, but their later films would largely be at least distributed by major studios, such as 20th Century Fox. So that was, a big reason or a big part of how they were able to increasingly find larger audiences. And just one more interesting note about Joel and Ethan. Well, this one's about Joel in particular. I still haven't seen this, but in 2021, he directed by himself. He was not collaborating with Ethan. Kind of a departure for them. But Joel by himself directed a new film version of Macbeth. Of course, the famous Shakespeare play that was for Apple TV, and I believe Denzel Washington was in the title role. So that's kind of cool. I haven't seen it. I plan to see it, but it's also noteworthy just because Joel was working alone, whereas they usually work together. But I did just want to say a little bit more about distribution before we get into the film itself, because if you remember last week, we were talking a little bit about distribution and how Parting Glances was distributed, how it got bought, by a distribution company, which then made it available to exhibitors, and that's how it ended up with at least a brief theatrical run. And then later, it made a little more money on the home video market. So I just wanted to return to a point that I was making last week about distribution, but really just kind of a larger point about the changing business model in American filmmaking. And Pearson talks about this as well, because as we've seen, he's involved on the business end, helping to strike these distribution deals with indie filmmakers. And one thing he points out is that in the 80s, as studio executives start to recognize the financial benefit to promoting independent film, we get sort of new companies, new studios, in some cases springing up. But in a lot of cases, and what makes this kind of complicated if we're talking about indie versus sort of mainstream studio film, is that a lot of these new indie studios are actually just sort of subsidiaries or branches or arms of major studios, like 20th Century Fox, like United Artists, like Universal, right? And like Pearson was saying, what a lot of these big studios did was they established these sort of separate branches that would mostly specialize in independent film. So they would go and find independent films that had already been produced, but the filmmaker was looking for a distributor, and they could go in, buy the film, often for very cheap, if this is a first-time filmmaker who doesn't have a big reputation or a lot of resources yet. buy the film for relatively cheap, distribute it, and obviously you're getting a big cut of the profits. So this is starting to happen more and more in the 80s, and we see another example of it here with this particular film. So the Coen brothers sold this film to a company called Circle Films, which used to be a subsidiary of Circle Theaters. So we start on the exhibition side. We have a company that's really just a chain of movie theaters, Circle Movie Theaters. But then they create a distribution company called Circle Films that's going to buy films and then distribute them. In many cases, they will be distributing them right to Circle Theaters, but they could also potentially do business with other exhibition venues. So originally, this is just a chain of movie theaters, I think, based in DC. But then they expand their model. They include a distribution company. And that distribution company, Circle Films, they're the ones who bought Blood Simple. I'm sorry, so I'm actually jumping the gun here. I got ahead of my notes. So I'm actually talking here about the Coen brothers' first film, Blood Simple. So it was distributed by Circle Films. And then later on, Circle Films was able to produce money to help get Raising Arizona actually made, to get the financing that they needed for the production side. So again, this is happening a lot. A lot of companies are sort of diversifying. They might start out as exhibition, they're adding distribution, and then in some cases, some of those distribution companies would later get into the production side. This would happen with Miramax later and other well-known sort of new studios, whether they're truly independent or not. That's kind of up for debate, but these are sort of new entities, or at least new arms of existing entities that are coming into existence, entering the sort of business here and just giving more opportunities to young filmmakers to get their movies produced and distributed. So this relationship with Circle Films is kind of important. Again, they just distribute Blood Simple, which was made totally sort of independently. The Coen brothers, I think, largely just raised the money, sort of financed it, probably maxed out credit cards. It's kind of a familiar story. But then when it comes to doing their second film, they're able to get financing from Circle Films. They're able to get help on the production side. And then Circle Films ends up selling the film to 20th Century Fox, a major studio, who then distributes it. And see, this is a part of that larger progression, because when you have a major studio distributing your film, like we said before, obviously that means the film's going to get a wider theatrical release, because that major studio simply has more resources. They can get that movie playing in more exhibition venues, more theaters. So more people watch it, more people talk about it, more people write about it, more people can recommend it. So, kind of understandable how that could be a big part of breakthrough success, or how that could be a big part of how indie filmmakers make it big and get an opportunity to start making bigger films. So after this one, most of the Coen brothers' future films would be distributed by major studios, or at least arms or subsidiaries of major studios. So some purists, some people might argue that after Raising Arizona, or maybe even after Blood Simple, their first film, the Coen brothers kind of ceased to be fully independent. Again, that's kind of debatable. We might consider Circle Films to really truly be an independent company, starting out as a chain of theaters in Washington, D.C., not part of that sort of L.A. Hollywood ecosystem. They start out just as theaters, they add the distribution company, and then eventually they get a little bit more involved in the production side as well. But when it comes time to really make money and sort of get the big breakthrough, again, Circle Films sells Raising Arizona to 20th Century Fox, and 20th Century Fox then distributes it to theaters. So just another reminder that the film industry is changing, but it's not like the big studios aren't still involved. They often swoop in and start getting involved once these filmmakers make a name for themselves, once they're getting critical attention. and once they've already proven to be, promising talents. And that's going to keep happening again and again, but often at the beginning of their careers, they are making films independently. It's just a question of how long that will last. So another reason why I picked this film, even though it's probably not their best, is it is kind of a good introduction to their overall style, their signature style, if we might call it that, as it sort of developed over the course of the late 80s and into the 90s. So just some words that we might use to describe the Coen brothers, words that are often used in reviews or film criticism centered on them. Quirky, funny, offbeat, a bit zany, maybe even a little over the top at times, satirical at times, definitely elements of satire, often heavily stylized, not always focused necessarily on realism. We can see a lot of examples of that here, often visually inventive in certain ways, smartly written, often very lovable, memorable, sort of goofball characters that we can see in some of those other films I mentioned as well, and a tendency to blend what we might sort of describe as often sort of broad comedy, elements of slapstick, sort of certain amount of silliness or cartoonish qualities, but blending that comedy with action or elements of crime drama. And it's often a very interesting effect when you observe that sort of combination, because, a lot of their films are considered comedies. Raising Arizona was generally thought of as a sort of weird, at times somewhat dark comedy, but still a comedy. And a lot of their films are thought of that way, although not all of them. I would argue some of their films really don't get categorized as comedies, but all of them have at least some comedic moments, some comedic characters, maybe some funny lines of dialogue. So there's always comedy, but that comedy always sort of coexists in an interesting way with real sort of violence and darkness and, some spooky, scary stuff at times. And a lot of reviewers and critics and, scholars have noted that over the years with the Coen brothers. And we can see a little bit of that here. A little bit of violence, a little bit of menace that sort of exists mostly under the surface, but it sometimes kind of appears a little bit more visibly on the surface. So we can see that in this film. We can see it in other films too. And sometimes that violence is a little cartoonish or maybe even played for laughs. But at other times there might be genuine unease, some genuine darkness to go along with the broad comedy that they often feature as well. And again, that's very true, of really all of their films. But they often play around with different genres. So that's one thing we'll notice about the Coens. If we've watched several of their films, we're going to notice that they jump around from genre to genre. They're not just making, certain types of films. So again, a lot of their films are considered comedies more or less, but they've also made westerns. They've made multiple crime dramas. I mentioned, Blood Simple is sort of just a modern day film noir, very much sort of ripped out of the 40s, just sort of set in what was then modern day Texas, but really just sort of a homage to that older film style, very much based on crime. Miller's Crossing is sort of a gangster drama set in like Prohibition era Chicago, I think. I might be wrong about the city, but I think definitely during Prohibition. So again, kind of a throwback crime drama. No Country for Old Men is really a crime drama with some Western elements. I mentioned True Grit, which is a straight up Western, but really does have some funny moments as well. And then, they have some movies that might be more straight up comedies, like The Big Lebowski. But they sort of jump around. They do different types of films, but yet their style remains recognizable, whether it's a Western, a comedy, a crime drama, whatever. So again, this movie I think is mostly a comedy, but we can see some of those crime drama or thriller elements at times making an appearance. So that's just true of the Coen brothers. They are kind of chameleons somewhat. They shift back and forth with different genres. But again, we'll talk about this as we go a little bit more. But they're also showing off their immense film knowledge. And they're drawing from a very wide array of different influences and references. So this film, when it came out, in '87, it was mostly reviewed favorably, thought of as sort of original. It had a sort of madcap originality, but not everybody necessarily dug it. Some reviewers thought the characters were a little bit underdeveloped, a little bit thinly drawn, and a lot of people did, I wouldn't say a lot, but some critics and viewers even objected to kind of the over-the-top, almost surrealistic tone that might grow a little tiresome at times for some viewers. And like I said, I think because it's one of their first films, it's maybe not fully realized, a little rough around the edges, maybe not fully developed, not a complete portrait of the Coen brothers' artistic abilities and vision. But it's kind of an early draft, and this is often how we see, early films from famous filmmakers. They might not be fully realized, but they're showing glimpses of what those filmmakers are about, what they will become. They're sort of introducing us to certain key characteristics of the filmmaker's style. And that style might become more refined, we cut out, just a little bit more refined, a little bit more smoothed out in future films, but we can sort of see the beginning of what the Coen brothers would come to be known for. So in some ways, I would compare them a little bit to Jarmusch, just in their ability to sort of imitate certain Hollywood styles. I don't know if I really got into this with Jarmusch, but if you're looking at some of the other films that he's done, he's a little bit the same way. He's done a Western. He did like a gangster / samurai movie. He works within established genres, sometimes to kind of satirize them or to show how they can be a little bit ripe for criticism or commentary in certain ways. He just kind of plays with some of the conventions. In some ways, he's faithful to them. In other ways, it might be thought of as sort of peculiar or like genre busting. But they know a lot of different genres. They can work within a lot of different registers. So, what they sort of often end up with are maybe mashups of different styles, different influences, different kinds of movies, but they take all of those disparate influences and turn them into something original. And it's thought of, I think a lot of indie filmmakers might be thought to do similar things. But we can also notice some larger themes at work here if we want to sort of get a little bit literary with this text, and I think we should for reasons that I'm about to share, but we can think a little bit more about character, which I think is an important element in this particular text. So with H.I. or Hi and Ed, we have two sort of absurdist characters, but they're kind of absurdist spins on what we might think of as a sort of classic American couple. So this is something the Coens will do at other times in their career. They're sort of taking what we might think of as like archetypes or certain tropes or ideas, recurring ideas featuring, the West or involving the frontier or just America in general. There's a lot of Americana here. There's a lot of sort of markers that should sort of put us in mind of things like, again, the West, exploration, adventure. These are a lot of the ideas that are kind of bouncing around, but everything is cranked up to 11 here. Everything is kind of over the top. Again, not really realistic, but we do see a lot of aspects of what might be called Americana or just like American pop culture. And even the characters themselves are sort of types. They're archetypes, right? They are familiar types of characters, again, sort of done up in an absurdist style here, but they are kind of recognizable. With Hi, we see kind of a lovable, ne'er-do-well, sort of a screw-up, a goofball, but he does sort of mean well in a certain way. He's sort of lovable, charismatic in a way that both perhaps makes us laugh, but also, could engender real affection for the character. And then Holly Hunter's character, again, is kind of a type that we see in a lot of American film, really. Sort of an honest, upright, good-natured, endlessly patient woman who sort of shapes up her ne'er-do-well mate, focuses his manic energy on something good, right? That's often an idea at work with characters like High. He's a criminal, right? But not a truly dangerous or violent one. He's somebody that has a certain amount of energy and capability, but he's always, spent it on the wrong things. So there's this idea that a good woman, again, this is sort of a trope that shows up in a lot of fiction, film, literature, whatever, that good woman can sort of get him focused and get him centered and get him devoting his energy to better ends. So we see it a lot, and a lot of reviewers picked up on that, and it's not a coincidence that we are out west. We are in Arizona, even though the characters' accents might sometimes suggest that we're elsewhere, but there's a lot going on here about the West. And, we even learn about High's heritage. We learn that he comes from a long line of frontiersmen and outdoor types. So again, that's kind of played for laughs, but the Coens are also probably providing some commentary on some of these tropes that we always see about the frontier or the West or manifest destiny, American exploration, pushing forth into unknown places, sort of a can-do, freedom-loving spirit. All of that's kind of on display here, but a lot of it might be satirized. We might be sort of poking fun at a lot of those things. And again, the Coens, by making these two characters sort of over the top, kind of absurd, almost cartoonish, again, that might be a part of the larger thematic message, which is maybe a lot of these tropes, a lot of these ideas are perhaps a little bit silly or at least outmoded, outdated. Perhaps we're questioning their usefulness. But just notice that. Notice that this is a film that's kind of commenting on some of these larger ideas, even in the midst of all the comedy. There's a lot of larger ideas about America, the West, and sort of what it means to be of that tradition or of that lineage, which is a very complicated lineage. Reviewers also picked up some other influences here, and these are important to note. The Bible and also Southern literature seem to show up in various ways throughout this text. So we might see some influence of Flannery O'Connor, who some of you have, I hope most of you have had to read at some point in some previous class. She's a well-known Southern writer who often writes what's referred to as sort of Gothic or Southern Gothic fiction, often featuring weird, sometimes grotesque characters, dark humor. So we can see some of that showing up in Raising Arizona. Also, we might detect the influence of William Faulkner, a really famous Southern writer, from basically the, mid 20th century, kind of early to mid. Again, most of you have probably read something by Faulkner, even if it was just, A Rose for Emily back in high school, or at least you know who he is. But again, some of his influence shows up here in the form of rural settings, low-life kind of redneck types, for the lack of a better way of putting it. Think about Gale and Evel Snopes, as good examples, or Snopes. In the film, they're Snopes. But in Faulkner, there's a whole family of characters with the last name of Snopes. So very similar, Snotes and Snopes. And Faulkner's sort of his larger literary world that kind of is centered in north central Mississippi, the Snopes show up in a series of different fictional works, and different Snopes are featured in different works, but they're sort of this low-life criminal family that lives, out in the country, but they're scam artists. They're thieves. They're often up to something. They're stealing stuff. They're scamming people in a lot of different works of fiction by Faulkner. So they're almost become like a shorthand for like criminality, sort of low down behavior, but they're also smart and they have a certain entrepreneurial spirit. But again, a little bit like High and very much like his associates, we see that they're using their energy and their skills towards bad things, right? They're directing all of their energy towards thieving and scheming and getting money for nothing, and hurting other people. But they are shown to be kind of formidable in their own way. But there's also some humor involved, because even though they often come into money, and they're often successful in their criminal schemes, they typically blow a lot of that money, although in time they do sort of find some avenues towards respectability, which again is often viewed as a real commentary by Faulkner on like the American dream and how some people can get to the top in this country through criminality, stealing, dishonesty, because if you're good at it and you can make money at it, that could be an avenue towards success. But anyway, we don't need to know too much about that, but just notice the names clearly. That's almost certainly not a coincidence. I'm pretty sure the Coens did it intentionally to sort of have a callback to this larger literary tradition, but also to kind of signal that these are the same kinds of guys. The Snopes are very much like Faulkner's Snopes. They are criminals. They're lowlifes. They kind of operate on the margins of society. But in some cases, we might laugh at them. We might develop a little bit of affection for them. But they're also kind of dangerous. And I think, that's important to remember as well. Another influence that's probably less recognizable, at least for most modern people, is Preston Sturges. Some of you might know him. He's pretty famous for film buffs. He was a director back in the 30s and 40s, and he was sort of known for doing these madcap, sort of manic comedies that feature sort of rapid fire dialogue, fast pacing, some slapstick comedy. And even if you're not familiar with any of Sturgis's films, and again, a lot of modern people aren't, but part of it doesn't really matter, because you're still probably familiar with some of those elements that he helped to pioneer, and that's sort of what has made him endure as a well-known figure, because a lot of the stuff that we see all the time in comedies or romantic comedies today, a lot of those conventions or tropes were kind of established by Sturges and other filmmakers working back in that time, as they sort of created what we would maybe view as like the modern cinematic comedy. So a lot of that is kind of on display here. Again, like the dialogue, the sort of that they're often called sort of screwball comedies, kind of characterized by rapid fire comic dialogue, some slapstick, absurd situations, but they often centered relationships as well. A lot of the end games of those types of movies would be the central couple, High and Ed here, overcoming various difficulties and ridiculous situations and ending up together at the end. So again, we can recognize a lot of that even today in modern romantic comedies. So that's why Sturges is still pretty well known, and the Coen brother, at least for, like I said, film nerds like the Coens, so they're using some of his styles and some of his innovations as well. So again, they really are steeped in film history and lore, and they often like to show off many of their relatively obscure references and bits of film knowledge. So they are beloved by film nerds and others today for this sort of distinctive style that takes all of these disparate influences, like we were saying, and sort of brings them together in a sort of fresh new way. But I would also argue their style has come a long way since '87. Maybe their films now feel a little bit more mature, a little bit more fully developed, but that's to be expected. They were still young filmmakers with Raising Arizona. We might also notice the cinematography here. Barry Sonnenfeld was the cinematographer. He would later go on to become a director, like many successful cinematographers. I think he's probably best known for directing the Men in Black films, at least maybe the first ones. I'm not sure how many of them he's done. I think he did the first one and maybe the sequel. But we do notice a very active, moving camera here. Very different than the visual style that we saw with Stranger Than Paradise or Parting Glances. A much more sort of dynamic, active camera in this particular film. We might notice some of these dramatic zoom-ins. We might almost have like a chaotic feel at times. But there's also a lot of sort of traditional medium and long shots. So it's not all manic. It's not all chaotic and full of movement, but there are those stretches. And I think for the most part, the film just visually might feel a little bit more exciting, a little bit more fast-paced than our first two films. And that's probably a true, if you're making that observation, that's probably a good one to make. But there's a lot of other things beyond just the camera work that sort of create this very odd, very distinctive, sort of fun atmosphere. Again, sort of a cartoonish atmosphere to an extent. But there's a lot of things you could consider. Set design plays a big role. You could think about costumes. You could think about hair. They all play a role in creating this very strange, again, not realistic, very absurdist, maybe a surrealistic kind of atmosphere or fictive world that we're in here. So we might want to consider the acting a little bit more, because we have been talking about Hi and Ed as characters and how they kind of represent some larger ideas that are important to American culture, pop culture, or sort of signal, what we think of as kind of like Americana, just things, places, ideas, styles that are just quintessentially American in some way. It can often be hard to describe it, but we know it when we see it. So we can talk about Nicolas Cage, who's obviously very famous, and a lot of people have different, depending on who you talk to, you can run into a lot of different opinions and evaluations of Cage as an actor. He is sometimes rendered as a meme or a punchline nowadays. Some people laugh at, his tendency to maybe overact. Some people would make that argument. He's a little over the top at times. He has a tendency to play a lot of sort of manic, twitchy characters. But I think he plays Hi pretty well, and we might do well to remember that he was sort of considered a serious actor through much of the late 80s, through the 90s, and he might even be experiencing a little bit of a comeback. I think he's appeared in some recent films that have generated some decent reviews. He can be effective. I think he's appeared in some bad movies. He's probably turned in some bad performances, but I think he plays Hi in an almost understated kind of way. He's not as ridiculous and over the top as I think he could have been. And I think he does play the character as, a genuinely sort of sweet, whimsical guy that's easy to root for, despite all of the, sort of ridiculous antics he gets involved in. We could also think about Holly Hunter as Ed. We could think a little bit about their accents. This is one thing I've had students mention before in previous classes. It almost feels like these characters are speaking in sort of stereotypical Southern accents, particularly Holly Hunter's character. And a lot of people are a little thrown off by that or confused by that. Why are they talking that way if this is supposed to be Arizona? And I think there are it's a fair criticism, but again, if we go back to some of those influences that I was mentioning earlier, Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor, some larger Southern literary traditions, also, at times almost like biblical language or imagery. I'll let you guys sort of, seek some of that out. There's some obvious ways that we can, maybe find some of that. Again, that's often largely tied to the O'Connor influence as well. A lot of her short stories draw heavily on the Bible, sort of apocalyptic imagery. So we find that's there. That kind of puts us in mind of some Southern literary traditions that could maybe partially explain the accents. We could also think of the West as maybe just a place where all kinds of different people go. We could also maybe just think of the accents as being part of the over-the-top, not entirely realistic, somewhat cartoonish, style and feel of this overall film. That might be fair as well. But for what it's worth, Holly Hunter, the actress portraying Ed, really is from Georgia. It almost seems like she's sort of tapping into her own, sort of heritage or background, because her accent to me, as a person from South Carolina, which is close to Georgia, feels very much like sort of a backwoods Southern accent. But again, they're sort of tapping into this sense that these people are, perhaps slightly outside of the mainstream. Again, that's another way that this film is often thought of. These characters are often thought of as sort of outcasts. They're strange, right? They're eccentric. Obviously, they're sort of marked as different. Some of that with High might come from his criminality. That's a good way to sort of marginalize yourself, is to commit crimes and go to prison. And then Ed sort of aligns herself with him and gets drawn into some of the trouble that he seems to attract. But again, they're sort of trying to attain something that's very quintessentially American. They want, some corner, some part of the American dream, some vision of domesticity, happiness, their share of wealth and success. And of course, they're making mistakes, or High goes about it in the wrong ways, but these are sort of misfit characters, outcast characters in certain ways, and the Coens often return to these types of characters who are sort of outside the boundaries of sort of what's maybe considered normal, mainstream, conventional American life, but they're either trying to break in to the mainstream, or at least they're trying to achieve their own sort of version of the American dream, and that can sometimes be played for laughs, and it often is, so we can notice all the comedy, but then we can also maybe think about some bigger picture things, or some symbolic or metaphorical things that might be connected to the American dream and these characters' pursuit of it. So, obviously Nick Cage would go on to be a huge movie star. He had already begun to sort of, break through. I think, maybe Moonlighting was maybe, or Moonstruck, which was, I think, the film where he starred with Cher. That kind of was maybe a star turn. I want to say that came out right around this time, maybe right after this film. And then Holly Hunter would really break through in 87 with Broadcast News, which, was a big hit and kind of established her as a very versatile actor. She later appeared in The Piano, a very famous film, and she also played a part in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? So she would later appear in some other work by the Coens. We also see a frequent collaborator with the Coen brothers, John Goodman. He shows up in a lot of their films. He has a small but important role here, kind of pitch perfect as one of those low-life criminal types. So there's a lot to dig into here. Again, the style and tone at times is a little strange. So I want us to try to, kind of navigate the comedy, some of the darker elements, some of the biblical or apocalyptic stuff that's on display, and also some of that larger commentary about America, the American dream, the American West, whatever it is we think the Coens are kind of after. Because this film might be viewed as a satire, it might be viewed as kind of a sweet romantic comedy to a certain extent, and maybe it can be viewed as something else altogether. So I'll let you guys make some final determinations, arrive at some conclusions, and then I just want to say a couple things in preparation for next week. So we're going to move in to a very different type of film next week, and we're actually going to spend the next couple of weeks watching documentaries, which are going to be quite different for our purposes than fiction films. So these first three movies are obviously works of fiction, very similar to what we would expect to find in short stories or novels in a typical English class. But what we're about to embark on starting next week and week 4 with The Thin Blue Line, we're going to get into documentary filmmaking, which is different. There are different intentions, different goals in mind, different techniques are being used. There's a different sort of tradition. And again, the difference in intention or purpose between documentary films and fiction films is something that I want to talk about next week. But another thing we're going to notice as we get into The Thin Blue Line is that part of the reason that film is so famous is it was a documentary that borrowed a lot of fiction film elements in order to tell its story. So we'll talk about that next week as well, and then that will get us ready for week 5 when we move into Roger and Me, another famous documentary. So just a quick heads up that we are spending the next 2 weeks on documentary films before returning to fiction films in week 6. Okay, so if you have any questions about anything, about screenings or any of the films, accessing the films, anything else that we've covered so far, please email me. I haven't heard from a lot of you. Seems like everybody's keeping up, but if you have any questions or concerns, just never hesitate to send me an email, and I will see you next week.